Well, good morning.
Hi.
How are you?
Well, functioning on all fours.
Functioning on all fours. It's almost like upright, vertical, and ventilated.
Almost.
So, welcome to our third edition of Conversations with My Dad, where we are talking to Chuck Anderson about life and theology and mythology and mythogenics and all of these different things. So, in our last conversation, we kind of ran the gambit. We went over the blind man and the elephant. We went over what's real, what's true, and what's so. We went over the framework of blame, shame, judge, and justify. What do we want to talk about today?
I'm completely open. I don't have anything particularly on my mind other than the taking the idea of what's so. You shared a story recently about a young fellow who went through a terrible experience, betrayal and ambush, and in the end, his summing up of his experience was that he's blessed. Now, that's not a claim that a lot of people would make having gone through what he experienced, but that's a mythogenic summing up when you realize that everything that you experience has meaning. And we give it the meaning, but we also derive and discover the meaning of our experience. And so trying to um, deal with the fact that everybody has a myth, everybody's living a myth, but not everybody owns their own myth. The narrative story of people is often hijacked by others.
Right. Well, and for the audience's sake, it's important to, I think, give credit where credit is due. This young man's name is Ross Capicchioni, grew up in Detroit, and has this incredible story about being shot 3 times by someone who was supposed to be a friend of his, uh, purportedly for an initiation into a gang as a ritual, but completely ambushed and betrayed, and managed to live through it and recover. And
shot in five different places: the head, the chest, the arm.
3, yeah.
3. I'm sorry, counting.
No, I mean,
but shot. But in the idea of betrayal, it's a shot to the heart too.
Oh, absolutely. And so coming back to that concept of the challenge is you have to have trust in order to betray. Right. The two are entangled, as we like to say. And how do you deal with getting to what's so after a lie that is so damaging?
Well, that's where we go back to one of our initial concepts was acceptance, gratitude, trust, and surrender. One of the things about acceptance is you have to accept that you were betrayed by your friend, that's so, whether you want it to be so. You have to accept that you weren't loved by your parents. We're to accept there's a lot of things that we have to accept in life. It isn't just obvious things, but oftentimes they're very painful and elements of life we'd rather avoid even thinking about. But acceptance has got a lot of dimensions to it. And in order to achieve significant growth in a spiritual way, it starts with acceptance that this is the way life really is. There's no magical thinking, there's no formula. It is straight on, painful, difficult, and complicated.
Right.
And people will continue to deny that to their own detriment.
Well, and I think, if you find the video, I found the video on Facebook and shared it on my page, of Ross telling his story. he goes through that entire process, and as he recounts his story, and goes from the, what we call the weaponized ambiguity of, how could this have happened, and, you know, not being able to draw any sense out of it. He comes to a point of acceptance and then goes through that program or that process of gratitude. And despite having been through this horrendous thing, his takeaway is, I am so blessed.
Which is a tremendous spiritual growth to be able to come to, after all the woe is me, to realize that there's meaning in all of that. It isn't just negative. It is negative. I mean, there's no doubt about that, but that isn't where the meaning resides. The meaning resides in there's something to be gained from that experience, whether it's keep getting up, keep going, which I think is a part of the underlying theme of his story and many other stories of just get up and keep going. Why? There's no logic in that. There's only its own imperative that it must be so. And this is where so is not just weak, it's a very strong way of being in the world.
Right. Well, and that instinct to continue to push forward, to stand up. He talks about that in his story, that I can choose to lay down here and die, or I can choose to get up, and going in and out of consciousness. I'm sure you've had some experiences in your life that were unsuspecting and surprising violence. I've had that experience as well. When I was, 21, I got jumped by 3 guys, and, they wanted to curb me. And, largely due to my wrestling background, the imperative was stand up. Don't stay on the ground. You're only going to get hurt or killed. Stand up. You need to be on your feet. Stand up. And I think that's been a theme for me my entire life, as I've encountered these other, tough situations of all kinds, whether it's physically standing up and getting back on your feet, or mentally and emotionally getting back up. You've got to stand up. You've got to keep moving forward. You've got to press. Otherwise you get overwhelmed. And I think a lot of people get caught in, we were talking about the inner courtroom in the last conversation, and who speaks for the defense, right? And I think a lot of people get caught in that inner courtroom and become paralyzed because they don't have anyone speaking in their defense. It's just all the arbiters and the accusers.
And to whom do you turn when there's no one to turn to?
Mythogenics.
Well, it's that inner knowing that says, this is so. I'm going to fight on, even though there's no point. But the point is, within me, I know something that defies logic, reason, or sound thinking of any kind. It is just so. And I can't reiterate enough. See, in the mythogenic journey, we don't have to justify. All we have to do is act. Okay, and a lot of people are troubled by that because our world's just so much talk. And when people don't talk but act, it creates a sort of a confusion in people, because craven hypocrisy is this idea that I say one thing but do another. And we see that demonstrated everywhere.
Right. Yes, we mentioned in our last conversation that people are hardwired for hypocrisy.
We covered a lot of a lot of territory in our last.
Yes, we did. So, how do you overcome that, right? Obviously, the most powerful move you can make is to not talk about something. Set a goal. Don't ever communicate it to anyone, and just go out and execute and achieve it. That's that surprising, almost audacious, and typically insulting type of a behavior. Your friends and your loved ones, if you don't consult them and look and seek their approval first and just go out and do, you become this alien entity to them. And it can be undermining in a relationship. How do you avoid that?
Well, the people who are professional in the goal attainment, and they talk about, you write it down. You don't have to blab it everywhere and tell it, because when you're writing it down, you're telling it to the universe. The universe is always listening, so you don't have to mouth it. But when you put it in writing, it puts intentionality, because you wouldn't go do through the exercise of writing something that you didn't actually intend. I mean, I imagine there are ways and means that people do that, but I mean, the point of it is you have to have a commitment to the universe that says, I'm serious. And the universe, for the most part, says yes. And, universe, are you listening? But that's the matter of spirituality in this and faith. And I believe that I can attain what my heart desires if I seriously intend to do so.
And as you've considered that, you talk about faith and spirituality, but you've also looked for an intersection with science to support this entire framework that you've developed. And as such, I mean, you've spent time with Joseph Campbell and Stephen Hawking, you've read a lot in physics. How does physics and that intentionality of the universe to deliver what you focus on and are attempting to manifest, how is that supported through science?
Could you repeat that? How was it supported by?
Through science, yes. How does science come up to support this spirituality and theological
I got it. Okay.
Framework of mythogenics?
The deal is, and I use quantum mechanics and other aspects of science as a metaphor, not as nuts and bolts. That for instance, my belief is that the relationship is the center of the universe. It is what the universe is built on because of the nature of gluons and quarks. There are no naked quarks in the universe. They're all in relationship or bound together with a quark to another quark or other atomic particles. But the point of it is, it's, if you look at it not just in the terms of scientific language, they're bound together, but they are in relationship. It's a more poetic way of saying the same thing. And I think that I don't want to misuse quantum mechanics in any significant way, but I want to illustrate that it's metaphoric, that we are not alone in the universe, because the universe is not alone within its own self. It is all bound and entangled. And these are complex scientific matters that have meaning and purpose. Is it all accidental that there are no naked quarks? It's just the way that nature decided it must be so. And then in a way, and I use that term, decided it must be so, because I think it's evidence of consciousness that by the way quarks handle disturbance, there's a rudimentary decision-making process that goes. I invite people to look at quantum chromodynamics to understand these options that somehow get chosen, but there's no brain, there's no personality, there's just choice happens.
And is it circumstantial? Is it coincidental? Is it intentional?
And it's always patterned the same. So the scientific part of it is part mostly about stimulation than any other thing. Science can revive. Science is the new mythology, and mythology has to regard science with great respect, but also with great artistic interest. To say, oh, how can I see into things more clearly with these scientific principles? The idea of um, particle wave. Philosophy up until the 20th century basically said that there's an excluded middle. When the particle wave experiment came along, it eradicated that. Everything is both and, not either or.
Superposition.
So if it's both and, that includes the basis for reconciliation on all kinds of issues that people fight long and hard about. The blind man and the elephant is because the fundamental thing that they couldn't see, but we can, is that there can be a tail and a trunk and an ear. It's not either this or that, but it's that and this.
It's an accretive approach to reality building.
Right. But what you discover first doesn't mean that's you discover only. And so in our discovery process, we discover something and we become very enthusiastic about it and exclusionary because we found something that we really think explains our experience. But ultimately, experience is not the final word, meaning is. See, and our experience has meaning. But in order to derive the meaning of the experience, we have to have flexibility in saying that we're not all knowing, we're not omnipotent, we're not omniscient, we're just fallible, sensitive human beings looking for our way in the world.
That's kind of a good segue to then also understanding that we're all on a journey that you like to call the way of wonder.
The way of wonder it's in contrast to what I call the way of expedience. There are two paths. The way of expedience is, well, what's quick, what's easy, the way of wonder is another path that is usually very unappealing, but you don't see it in advance. You just reject this way and go this way. And all of a sudden we encounter a great number of unexpected things, opportunities or experiences that we had no way of knowing ahead of time would lie along that path. And the problem with the way of wonder is you usually don't know you're on the way of wonder until you're looking backwards. It's kind of like that footprints in the sand story, the poem that's very popular. Looking back, I see footprints in the sand. And sometimes there are only one pair there, and that is because wonder was involved.
Well, for those who aren't familiar with the poem, let's do it its proper justice here, right? The footprints in the sand is there were two sets of footprints in the sand that proceeded for a while until there was just one. and the person is reflecting with God and saying, God, why did you leave me alone and force me to walk alone? And God says, no, when there was only the single set of footprints, that's the time I carried you. That, I think, is the real import of that story. So,
Right.
let's do that part justice. But how does that tie into kind of the way of wonder? I mean, how are those two related?
Well, in a sense, they're synonymous. They're not just related, because we experience our journey by ourselves, but we're not alone. But how do you prove you're not alone?
Well, how do you prove anything?
That's right. But what happens is something, you'd be desperate, for instance, to pay your mortgage, but no money to do so. And then one morning your son goes out to the mailbox and finds just enough money to deal with getting the mortgage taken care of and going on.
Not just the money, but what else was attached to that?
There was a note attached to that.
So this is a personal experience.
Your personal experience, but the point of wonder is that.
No, before we get on to the point of wonder, let's share the story. This is, I think, a fundamental narrative point in the story of our family and our family mythology, right? So I can kind of walk us through that a little bit. What was this experience, and how is it related to the way of wonder?
Well, the mechanics of the experience are your knowledge, not mine. You were the one that discovered the money in the mailbox.
Well, sure, but what was the situation? What brought it to the point where there was this desperate need?
The marshal was coming to evict the family from the house.
And why was the marshal coming to evict the family from the house?
Because of incompetence on my part.
Well, I don't know that that's fair. That sounds like there's no defense attorney in your inner courtroom.
Well,
circumstantially, what was going on in Orange County in the early 1990s?
I have no idea.
The county went bankrupt.
Yeah.
About the same time that the county went bankrupt, you were a business owner and you had a printing business.
Yeah, but they weren't related.
Well, no, they weren't related. They were correlated.
Okay, you want to correlate them. But desperation was and I personally had a spiritual crisis, and I basically said to God, God, these are your children too.
Well, let's build to that, right? You're jumping around here. Let's be linear for a moment, and let's actually tell this story. You owned a printing business, correct?
I did.
Okay. What happened with your printing business?
It went out of business.
And how did it go out of business?
Because it's an absurd thing. It was too successful. And one of the things, I had orders that were so large, I couldn't pay for them. And it created a cycle that, and then I had a big account that moved out of state and left me in a cash flow crisis. And I did not have the wherewithal to handle that situation.
It would seem to me that that's an important set of circumstances around this entire.
Well, see, it was all wonder to get to that moment. And then when we were at it, and so then the only place I in desperation turned to God.
Okay, so, well, before we even get to that, let's tell the story, right?
Well, that essentially is the story.
Well, yeah, but there's more to it, right? So I'm going to go ahead and take over then and tell the story, since you're so reluctant to do so. You were in this position where your business that we were all involved with, it was a family-run business. We had to fold and print, fold your print jobs and package them and put them in envelopes. And, nightly, your children were involved in helping this business to go. And it was doing well. And it was paying for the entire family's, existence. And, Mom, I believe at the time, was just starting to go back to get her education certifications and in preparation of becoming a teacher and stepping into her professional life, right? So all of these things are part of the dynamics of what was going on around the time. And in that moment where the bills are due, you couldn't afford to finance the jobs that you'd been contracted to deliver on, everything started to cascade and fall and shut down in front of you. It was the collapsing of a wave function, right?
It's a good way to put it.
I think that's important to this conversation, because often I think people experience a similar thing where reality says, hey, here's this path that you're on, and you have some vision of where that path is supposed to be leading you, until reality interjects and the wave function collapses, and everything that was on that trajectory suddenly is cut off from you. It's no longer a possibility, and it may not be because of anything that you've done. Sometimes we're just subjected to it. So in this story, as the business is having to be let go and the mortgage is going unpaid, in that moment where you realized that you were no longer in control. And I think that this is why the story is so powerful, is because of really the mythology of control. Everyone likes to believe that they are in control, but that's vanity. That's egotism. More often we're not in control. And walking that path of acceptance, gratitude, trust, and surrender, I believe that this moment specifically was so fundamental in our conversations, deconstructing things over the last couple of decades, that this particular experience helped inform and lead you to that framework of acceptance, gratitude, trust, and surrender. So in this moment where everything is falling apart, you've tried everything you can to save the business, couldn't save the business, the mortgage is going unpaid, we get an eviction notice from the sheriff that we've got a couple of days to be out of the house. Now let's take that moment, and in that moment when you realized you couldn't do it anymore, what was your conversation with God? Like, describe that. I mean, how did that unfold?
I'm repeating, like, because I said it before, and I want to make a refinement. There's a difference between being responsible and being in control. Okay, I accept responsibility but I don't. Control was a struggle, and it always is. But with the pressure of the marshal coming in, they served notice and that they were going to evict us. I stood in the living room.
What time of day? What time of day was this?
Early in the morning. I had no options, just this feeling of desperation, but accepting the fact that the marshal's coming, and I have to trust and surrender that somehow, God, these are your children as well. Help me. And then you went out to the mailbox, and you came in with an envelope full of $100 bills.
Which I had no idea what was in the envelope. It was sealed. And there was a note attached to it that said, "To the Anderson family, may God bless you always." And how much was in the envelope?
There was just $1,500 was in the envelope, which is just what we needed. Actually, it solved that problem at that moment. It was just enough, just in time. That's one of the first things I learned about the way of wonder, is it always provides what's needed when you need it. Not more, not less, just enough, just in time. Now, most people who hear this story don't believe it because these things don't happen to them. And so there's no way I can convince anybody that it happened, or you can convince anybody.
Other than we lived through it.
When we lived through it, was our experience.
It was our experience.
We had the tail, on the elephant.
Okay.
I mean, we experienced this thing truly. It got us, put us in a position to go on. And
well, and to me, one of the more interesting parts of this entire tale is that the day before, you and Mom had gone and looked at the house that you ended up moving into for 25 years, and you hadn't told anybody.
No, nobody knew we were in the streets. Not family, not friends. We were very tight-lipped about the whole thing.
Because people don't tend to want to admit when they're up against the wall with no options, right? It's terrifying and embarrassing, and all of these other, just tense types of conflicting personal emotions. And so for something like that to happen, I mean, truly, it's a miracle.
Well, here we are 30 years later, and I still am reluctant to share it, because it's unbelievable. It's really but I believe it, and this is where I learned the idea of acceptance, gratitude, trust, and surrender is powerful. It's not just a fallback position when you're desperate, but it actually has impact in the world. And in that particular moment, we drew a collective sigh of relief, but confusion, because where did it come from? Who knew?
And have we ever found out?
No, to this day, because our relatives were all financially unavailable to us. We had no friends that knew about it, but somebody knew. Somebody knew from some source, and I, to this day, cannot say what that source is, but I'm eternally grateful, and I want to acknowledge that it's not anything I did or any of us in the family did, except we received it with gratitude and we moved on, and it took us to some wonderful places after that.
I am blessed.
See, then that's like the young man's story. To be able to say, I am blessed, but confused too.
Well, I mean, being blessed doesn't mean you get out of it without getting bloodied, right?
Yeah.
And I think that is one of the biggest struggles that we face in today's society, right? There's this cult of joy is kind of what I call it. All these people out there preaching happiness and, as a way of being in the world, and that it's some type of a sustainable, never ending bliss that you can achieve in your life and live in that state entirely. Maybe they can, maybe they can't.
Yeah. Well, Joseph Campbell, the eminent mythologist, advocates follow your bliss, and in your bliss you'll find what joy that you're meant to encounter. But cleverly enough, he admits the fact that there are blisters in following your bliss. That we, that because life is still painful, difficult, and complicated, even when you're following your bliss, even when you're filled with joy. There's still things that are poking holes in,
Sometimes that waveform collapses.
because that's the nature of the universe. The universe doesn't hold a permanent state. And we in our hearts want permanence. We want things to be absolutely the same forever. That's a toxic mythology, because nothing remains in a static situation. Because going back to science, entropy enters in. Entropy is a significant part of all that happens in the universe. It will end.
It will end. And yet it doesn't, right?
Not yet.
Well, I mean, and energy is neither created nor destroyed.
First law of thermodynamics.
First law of thermodynamics. So if that's true, all it can do is change. But change is terrifying.
And that's because we are mythically unprepared for change. We're mythically prepared for everything to stay the same. And then when it doesn't, what? And that's where all of this is as much spiritual as scientific or anything else, is that our job is to be flexible in the changing nature of the universe. That it's going to deliver to us things we cannot envision or expect. And yet, how do we get out of our rut and open ourselves up to new possibilities? You know, this is the idea. Change is often opportunity disguised as something we don't know. You know, but how do you optimize opportunity when you don't recognize it? It just looks like unwanted reality. So, and there's no perfect response to that. That's the painful, difficult, complicated part of being human. You know, and you're talking about ambiguity a while ago, and in dealing with people, there are people who specialize, particularly like narcissists and people like that, who weaponize ambiguity, who make you think that, you know, it's a lie, but they present it in such a way that it doesn't seem dishonest. You know, I remember.
Well, I think it's more than that.
Well, I'm sure it's a lot more than that.
You know, I mean, the thing about weaponized ambiguity is it is a lack of clarity that creates an undue damage. It's abusive. It's an abusive refusal to make anything clear.
But we cooperate in that oftentimes.
Right, because we want to believe anything. So weaponized ambiguity allows you to draw your own conclusions that may or may not be true, and typically aren't, without the onus of the person who is creating that ambiguity to share in any kind of responsibility for the conclusions that you decide to draw.
See, that's a net effect of the story of the young man who was shot. He knew the guy, but the guy basically was ambiguous
about why they were there and what they were going for, and he was held in the dark and decided based off of what he knew of himself and what he thought he knew of that other person that this should be okay.
Sad but true, they weren't.
And almost lost his life. So, you know, this isn't really just it's not a theoretical concept of, emotional and psychological abuse. When it's weaponized that way, it becomes a absolute intensive threat to your life.
Yeah. So all of these things we're talking about, they're not theoretical, and they're not uncommon. But many people experience it, but they don't know how to frame it to tell a story. See, like one way to frame the story is he almost lost his life. But another way of framing it is, in it, he found his life. He found much more than he lost. But you can't know that going into it up front.
It's hindsight makes that clear on the way of wonder.
Footprints in the sand. So we're not talking about this happy thing where people are got to be happy. You got to be, no, you don't. You have to be real. And when joy is, and there is profound joy in the world, when it is, you embrace it. But when joy turns to a lament, you have to recognize that as well and say, yeah, I don't like this. But mythology isn't going to change that, because the mythology is it's painful, difficult, and complicated. Oh, please, let there be something else. I haven't seen evidence of any other thing.
Then that life is only ever three things, which is painful, difficult, and complicated.
And just because you have some joy in it, it doesn't mean it's going to last. And it doesn't mean it's going to go away instantly. You just don't know what it means. It just, we accept it. We're grateful for it. We trust, and we let it all go. That's the story.
It's a pretty powerful story.
If we allow it to be, it is. But overthinking it, and many people overthink it. Why do I want to be grateful for this mess? I can think of a lot of myths that are about that. There's one of the famous story is told by the founder of Temple University. He used to tell in his fundraising efforts, he told a story about acres of diamonds, about a South African farmer who decided he wanted to go search for diamonds. And so he sold his farm. And the guy that bought it came across some rocks in the ground, turned out to be one of the most productive diamond mines in South Africa. The guy had basically been sitting on acres of diamonds. But a diamond in the rough doesn't look like a diamond. It just looks like another
rock.
So recognizing opportunity is probably the most profound thing that myth offers us the possibility of doing. Is that I see this and I see this. Well, what do I actually see? Am I really seeing what's there, or am I seeing what I hope is there, or am I seeing what I'm afraid is there? See, relationships is like that. When we come into a new relationship, what do we see? There's hope and promise and lust, or there's fear of commitment and games that people play. What is our myth of relationship? Do we have to, being good at relationship, is that actually a thing? Or is it just being real? And it works out how it works out.
Well, and I think this is a great question specific to this conversation, actually. And overall. You stated earlier that the fundamental state of the universe is relationship. But if that is true, then again, you can't be good or bad at relationship. It is part of the way that you are fundamentally, right? It's at our core. And we interpret good or bad relationships. Sometimes the avoidance of a connection is the most appropriate relationship that you could possibly have. But there's a tendency to think on those types of situations in negative terms, where romantic situations and family, those are positive typically, but not across the board. Plenty of people have terrible family situations that are not positive, that are damaging and abusive and toxic. And so, how do people come to grips with that relationship, right? And I think you've done a good job. I'm just going to give you some kudos here as a father. A number of years ago for Christmas, you gave all of us kids a book called Travels with Odysseus. For those that aren't familiar with it, can you kind of walk us through that book a little bit?
Well, let's say most people, I'm sure, are familiar with the Odyssey. It's a Homeric poem. It's an adventure story that's been around for nearly 2,000 years. And people think of it as an adventure. But actually what it is it's a psychological exploration. And the author of Travels with Odysseus shows each of the adventures in the context of a psychological framework
Of archetypes.
of archetype, and say, what is it that we could learn from that? Because the whole idea of the Odyssey is not to get home, which a lot of people are, but it's to become conscious. And that's a very elusive subject for everybody. What does it mean to be conscious? But what does it mean to be home except to be conscious? And the stories of Odysseus, the travels with Odysseus, are each one leading us to a different level of, or a different aspect of consciousness. For instance, the Cyclops story. Odysseus and his crew get stranded on an island, and there's this monster with one eye who captures them in his cave, and they have to escape. And Odysseus, being conscious, says to the guy, when this Polyphemus is his name, asks Odysseus who he is. Odysseus says, "I'm no man." And Polyphemus takes that as his answer. And in order to escape, they wind up stabbing him in his eye, so he's blinded, and they escape. And then he's yelling out to his neighbors for help, the other Cyclopses. And they say, "What's the matter?" And he says, "No man has hurt me." And so they effect their escape from the others. But interestingly, in the story, they're in the ship rowing away, trying to get away from the island. And Odysseus can't help himself. He has to taunt the Cyclops. And he says, it is I, Odysseus, who has blinded you and defeated you. And while he's proclaiming this,
In this moment of hubris,
the Cyclops picks up a boulder and throws it and barely misses the boat. And we who are reading the story or hearing the story, or those in the boat, will say, "Shut up, sit down, let's get out of here." But he has to go on taunting. Well, it's the taunting where he identifies himself to Polyphemus, who is the son of Neptune. So he tells Neptune that it's Odysseus who's wounded him. And in that moment of hubris, it can be looked at, everybody's in this, why did you have to do that? Well, the funny thing is, or to me, the funny thing is that if he hadn't stood up in that boat and proclaimed who he was, it just would have been another travelogue. He'd have gone home. But by proclaiming who he was, he opened himself to all the vicissitudes of antagonizing the gods. And it made all the adventures possible because he decided to be who he was, good, bad, or indifferent. And in a way, we are like that too. So that's part of the travels with it is to take the stories and dissect them a little bit and say, okay, it's true for him. What about us? And that's why I gave you all this stuff on the book. And I think you all read it and enjoyed it.
Yes, I think we've all been able to apply it in various ways to our own stories and journeys and re-extrapolate things. So, again, I'm grateful. It's, it's a win. It's not your typical, gift of, and you've never been a typical gifter. You don't like to give people things. The consumer side of things is not, your.
Well, I like to share things that I found meaningful, because it doesn't mean you'll find it meaningful, but you may, or maybe not today, but some years down the road, you never know. Because that old expression, when the student's ready, the teacher will arrive, that often comes in the form of a book.
Sure. Well, we're going through this now, right? When shortly after or while you were going through losing the business and having the house foreclosed on and, having the miracle of somebody, gifting us money and getting into a new place. At that point in time, you bought the book, Job, A Comedy of Justice by Robert Heinlein. And found some use in it from what you were telling me the other day, at the time. But because you bought that book, it was on a bookcase that we kept kind of next to the downstairs bathroom. And, when I was a late teenager, I found that book and decided to give it a read. And it's been one of the most profound companions on my journey over the last 20 years. To the point where, I bring it up on a regular basis and, re-recommended it to you.
Right.
And you've just recently repurchased it and are reading back through it, and you're coming across things that you don't recall.
Well, because I was a very difficult point in my life. And some of it was too close to home. When art and life start to merge, there's a certain quality to that experience that becomes like the book.
Indeed. So where are you in the book at this point in Job, A Comedy of Justice?
Well, I'm about midway through the book. In terms of place, he's just found the trucker put a gold piece. The trucker had put a gold piece in his pocket, and they needed, because they were going to need money to spend the night, and they had no money.
All right. Well, Mom's poking around, making noise now. So why don't we go ahead and just leave it there for this time, and we'll kind of pick up at this point on the next conversation. All right. Awesome.
So you're being very quiet.
No, you're not being very quiet.
See, the microphone's sensitive enough to pick up